The gospel lesson is from Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19, and can be found in the Pew Bible in the New Testament on page 80. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And they went, and they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." The word of the Lord. The opening verse has Jesus traveling along the border between Samaria and Galilee on his way to Jerusalem. This verse has led many scholars and commentators to perceive that Luke only had a vague grasp of the Palestinian geography. It's too bad he didn't have access to GPS or Google Maps or even a smartphone like we do today. When I first became a hospice chaplain some 10 years ago, I can't tell you how many times that first week I called my husband Trent, near tears, saying, "I'm lost. Help me find this place." All I had was a Mapsco. Can you imagine? That's like dinosaur days. I was doing the best I could with that map, but it wasn't working. Within the second week, as a chaplain, my husband surprised me with a GPS. I think it was more for him than it was for me. But today, I can't imagine my life without it. So I can only imagine what it must have been like back then, not to know the geography. You'd have to travel using landmarks and the well-worn paths. Those were your only guides. Traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, Jesus would have been going north to south. And actually, there is no region between Samaria and Galilee. Since Galilee lay above Samaria, Jesus may have traveled near the border between the two regions as he made his way to the Jordan to skirt around Samaria. And this well-worn path is the one that most Jewish travelers would have taken during this time. Regardless, the point that Luke is making is that Jesus was in a place where he would likely run into a Samaritan. Jesus approached a village where 10 seriously ill men came out to meet him. And unlike the NRSV version that I just read, the NIV version identifies the men not as lepers, but as men who had leprosy. In Luke 5:8, Luke referred to the man who was paralyzed not as a paralytic, but as a man who was paralyzed. And in Luke 8:27, he identified the Gerasene demoniac as a man who had demons. I like the NIV version much better. It's a subtle difference, but it reflects a humanness, an attempt to reclaim the dignity and personhood of those who were afflicted. In hospice, we do the same thing. We view our patients not as their illness or their impending death, but we see them as living human beings, capable of love and still being loved. The 10 men with leprosy, 10 men afflicted with the worst disease imaginable in Jesus' day. Leprosy was incurable, and it was disfiguring. Those with leprosy died a slow and painful death. They were cut off from family and all of society, and their only companionship were others who had leprosy. There were 9 others in this case who kept reminding each one of them how bad things really were. Who dressed their wounds? Who would draw their water and provide food for them? Who attended to their spiritual and psychosocial needs? These men have lost everything that mattered to them. Who was providing for their families that were left behind? I can only imagine the grief that they were experiencing, living the life of an outcast. There were rumors of a man who could restore their health. And when they saw Jesus, they cried out, "Master, have mercy on us." They raised a voice in unison. Later, their response to their healing will be much different to their unison voice at this point in the story. They must have known that this was their only chance to escape the devastation of their disease. If Jesus did nothing for them, surely their lives would end in a slow and painful death. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. Imagine how the air must have been filled with tension as 10 lives hung on the words or actions from this man from Galilee. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He didn't touch them. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He didn't wash them. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He didn't even pray for them. Finally, after what seemed to be an eternity for these desperate men, Jesus spoke, "Go show yourselves to the priests." In other words, Jesus was saying, go to the priests for certificates of cleansing. They weren't healthy, but they were to go to the priest to get a health certificate to proclaim that they were made clean. Basically, Jesus said, go get a physical examination by the priests. Imagine for a moment what must have been going through their minds. They must have stood there looking at each other thinking, but we've already been there. We've been declared unclean. You have got to be kidding. Go show ourselves to the priests? They had expected something more immediate. Yet out of their desperation and their growing but still doubting faith, these 10 men turned and started walking towards the priests. Something about this man of Galilee led them to obey, to go and do what they had done before, but this time, something was different. This time, it was Jesus that told them to go. And then it happened. At some point, perhaps in an instant, and quite by surprise, those 10 outcast men were healed. Every diseased cell suddenly sprang into full health by some unseen force, a force of events which began in the twinkle of an eye, and then a flash of excitement as one of the 10 noticed his body becoming healthy. Who was the first to notice? We don't know, but with tremendous swiftness, the reaction must have spread throughout the group. In amazement, they stopped. They looked at their hands, their feet, at each other. They were whole again. They had been made clean. Jesus miraculously healed again, and his reputation remained true. 10 suffering human beings have been touched by the Son of God. 10 suffering men have been touched by the creating hand of God that was still at work in their world. Can you see them bounding down the road to the priest, now running, now leaping and dancing, wondering how the priest was going to react? They were anticipating the excitement of their families as they would return home healthy and alive, with a health certificate proclaiming everything that happened. All 10 men got caught up in the joy and the excitement of the moment. But one of them stops in his tracks. He smiles, he turns, now walking, now jogging, now running, back to the Master, back to this man of Galilee, back to the one who healed them with some mysterious force. He comes back shouting and proclaiming glory to God with a joyful and thankful heart. He runs back to Jesus, falls at his feet, and gives the Son of God thanks for the great healing that had been done. Only one of the 10 who were touched by the love of this man had seen beyond the miracle of healing to the one who had dared to risk his life for them. He saw Jesus for who he was. Jesus was one who cared, who loved, and who wanted a relationship with him. What makes this story so remarkable is the fact that this man was a Samaritan. Samaritans were seen as unclean people. They were descendants of mixed marriages that followed the fall of the northern regions. And just as in the story of the Good Samaritan, in this story, Jesus continues to break down boundaries of social class, of race, and of religion. The act of seeing plays an important part in this story. In verse 14, it states that Jesus saw them and responded to their need. Verse 15 tells us that one of the men afflicted with leprosy saw that he was healed and turned back. The first instance is the recognition of the need of others. The second instance is the recognition of God's deliverance and grace. The Samaritan saw the Son of God as a man of love and a builder of relationships. He saw the miracle of Jesus' way of building a bridge between the fallen creation, the brokenness of disease, and the loving hand of the God who wants to reach into that brokenness with his creating and redeeming power. He simply saw Jesus. Then notice Jesus' response. Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Only 1 in 10 came back to give thanks? Why? Jesus is asking. Why? Only 1 in 10. By dwelling on the fact that only 1 in 10 came back, Jesus was telling them very plainly that he wanted to be thanked. He wanted them to see beyond the miracle to the miracle worker. He wanted them to come into a relationship with him. What happened to the other 9 men? Perhaps they never stopped to reflect on what really happened. They didn't think about the who or how this happened. They were healed and their lives could go on. They couldn't see beyond the gift of the miracle of healing to the one who gave it to them. They never saw the giver. Can you see the giver? Can you see beyond the gifts, the blessings, the love, the touch of grace in your own lives? Do you see the Redeemer, the Son of God, as you experience his touch in your life? Maybe another reason that only one of the 10 returned to the healer is the fact that the other 9 lacked humility. They saw in this act of healing as something they were entitled to experience. It's no different today. We can develop such an inflated sense of our own self-importance that we take everything for granted that comes to us, sometimes with a feeling like we deserved it. We tend to take for granted all those things that we have, as we tend to look only to ourselves as a foundation for living. As a result, we become more and more concerned about ourselves than of our neighbors. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 through 7, it says, "Of course there is great gain in godliness with contentment, for we brought nothing into the world, so that we can take nothing out of it. When a person views the world as owing him or her something or everything, then contentment is never achieved. In our contentment with the great gifts that God has granted to us, we can see beyond the giver to the gifts. But if we always focus on the gifts, we will never see the giver. If we never look beyond our selfishness for more, then contentment with life, unfortunately, will never be achieved." What do we see? And what do we do when we see? Do we recognize the needs of others? Sometimes I'm asked to visit the family and patient of a dying patient. The family may be anxious or agitated and sometimes difficult, complaining about every little thing. Our nurses, actually all of our staff, our home health aides, chaplains, social workers, they're all trained to know when someone is experiencing what we call anticipatory grief. That is when you are already grieving the one who is dying. When I go, I usually begin the conversation with them at anything as possible to try to get to the root of their agitation. It is usually fear. For the family, it's fear of living a life without their loved one. For the patient, sometimes it's the fear of pain. And of course, always the fear of what will happen to their family when the patient is gone. And so I start with working with the family to get to that root, to find out what it is that's causing this anxiety and agitation. And sometimes I find that it's just the need to be reconciled with one another. And when that's the case, I take them through the 5 things that we say when someone is dying. And those are, "I'm sorry, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you." And we have the family members say it to the person who's dying, and if possible, if the person that's dying can still speak, we have them say it back to the family member, so that gift of reconciliation can happen. But if our nurses, if our staffs, we're not paying attention to the family, to the agitation, to the stress, that gift of reconciliation might never have happened. We need to pay attention to what's going on around us. The Samaritan scene was simply God's deliverance and grace. 10 were healed, but only one recognized it for what it was. The grateful person reveals a spirit of humility and sensitivity to the love and kindness of others. Life is a gift. Good health is a gift. We don't think about it until we lose it. What do you do when you see? It's hard to see when we're so attached to our phones and all of our electronic devices. I encourage you to put them down for a week and see what you see. In the end, Jesus tells the Samaritan, "Your faith has made you well." His faith was expressed in a cry of grateful praise, but only his loud voice was heard, unlike the unison cry for help from all of the afflicted in the beginning of the story. In a moment, we will affirm our faith and let our voices reflect our grateful praise for what God has done for us. Amen.